The Detroit Lions are entering a fascinating moment in the life cycle of a rising NFL franchise. A few years ago, this organization was the model of a rebuilding success story. They were the team that finally figured it out. A front office led by Brad Holmes had cracked the code: draft elite talent, develop it patiently, reward it with extensions, and build a roster that could compete year after year. At the center of that vision stood cornerstone players like Jared Goff, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Penei Sewell, young stars who became the foundation of the Lions' resurgence. 2 years ago, Detroit made a series of aggressive financial commitments that signaled something important to the rest of the league. These weren't just contract extensions. They were declarations of identity. The Lions were betting on themselves, locking in their homegrown stars, and committing to a philosophy that had already started to pay dividends. Soon after those deals were finalized, defensive tackle Alim McNeill joined the group with a major extension of his own, reinforcing the belief that Detroit's championship window would be built around a young, drafted core rather than expensive outside acquisitions. From a football perspective, this approach makes perfect sense. Drafting and developing players is the most sustainable path to long-term success in the NFL. It creates continuity in the locker room. It establishes a shared identity between players and coaches. And it allows a franchise to avoid the trap of overpaying aging veterans on the open market. But as every successful team eventually discovers, building a contender is only the first step. Maintaining that contender is the real challenge. The NFL is structured around parity. The league wants competitive balance, and it has several mechanisms designed to prevent any one team from dominating indefinitely. The salary cap forces tough decisions. Winning teams draft later in the first round. Free agency pulls talent away. Eventually, every front office reaches a point where they have to decide which players to keep, which players to replace, and which risks are worth taking. Right now, the Lions are living through that exact moment. This offseason, Detroit quietly said goodbye to several familiar faces. Offensive lineman Taylor Decker, guard Graham Glasgow, running back David Montgomery, linebacker Alex Anzalone, defensive tackle Roy Lopez, cornerback Amik Robertson, and return specialist Khalif Raymond all moved on. On paper, that's a significant amount of experience leaving the building. These were players who had played meaningful snaps and helped shape the Lions' identity during their rise. But if you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, a pattern begins to emerge. Most of those players were not originally drafted by Brad Holmes. They were important contributors, but they were not the long-term pillars of the organization's blueprint. The Lions knew these departures were coming long before they actually happened, and in many cases, the replacements were already in place. When Detroit drafted running back Jahmyr Gibbs, it signaled that the backfield would eventually transition away from Montgomery's role. When the team selected cornerbacks Terrion Arnold and Ennis Rakestraw Jr., it was preparing for the future of the secondary. At linebacker, former first-round pick Jack Campbell was always expected to inherit leadership responsibilities from Anzalone. Even along the defensive line, young talent like Tyleik Williams is expected to absorb a growing share of snaps moving forward. This is what a youth movement looks like in the NFL. It doesn't always feel dramatic, but it fundamentally reshapes the roster. Detroit's average age has quietly dropped near the bottom of the league. For a franchise that recently competed at the top of the NFC, that's a remarkable shift. The Lions are attempting to do something very difficult: stay competitive while getting younger. Of course, youth does not automatically equal improvement. That's where the real risk lies. Replacing a reliable veteran with an improving young player requires faith. It requires confidence in scouting, coaching, and development. For example, expecting a 7th-round pick like Dominic Lovett to replicate Khalif Raymond's production is far from guaranteed. Trusting Ennis Rakestraw to replace Amik Robertson means betting on potential over proven performance. Even along the offensive line, the Lions are navigating uncertainty as they search for the long-term successor to Taylor Decker. And that's before you even consider the unpredictable nature of injuries. Just weeks after signing his extension, Alim McNeill suffered a devastating ACL tear. Around the same time, star safety Kirby Joseph developed a troubling knee condition that forced him to miss significant time and raised long-term concerns about his durability. These situations highlight the uncomfortable truth about NFL roster building. Even the best strategies can be derailed by circumstances no general manager can control. Right now, those pressures are showing up in Detroit's free agency approach. Many Lions fans expected an aggressive spending spree after a frustrating 2025 season. Instead, the early days of free agency have been unusually quiet. More players have left than arrived, and several key defensive positions remain thin. The pass rush opposite Aiden Hutchinson still needs reinforcement. The linebacker unit is adjusting to major departures, and the secondary remains a work in progress. Yet there are signs that the front office is still following its established blueprint. The Lions added running back Isaiah Pacheco, a high-energy player who perfectly embodies the aggressive culture created by head coach Dan Campbell. Pacheco's introduction to Detroit immediately resonated with fans. During his first press conference, he spoke passionately about his love for the game, his desire to compete, and his excitement about joining a locker room known for toughness and accountability. His style fits the Lions' identity perfectly. Pacheco runs with violence, urgency, and emotion. He thrives in physical football environments, and Detroit's offensive line, anchored by Penei Sewell, could provide the ideal setting for him to rediscover his peak production. In the secondary, Detroit quietly added versatile defensive back Christian Izien. While he may not be a household name, his positional flexibility and strong run defense make him an intriguing addition to a defense that values versatility. The Lions also retained depth cornerback Rock Ya-Sin on a cost-effective deal, ensuring continuity in a position group that dealt with injuries last season. Even the offensive line received a subtle but important addition with swing tackle Larry Borom. Borom may not project as a long-term starter, but his ability to play multiple positions gives Detroit valuable insurance if injuries strike. At this point in the script, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the Detroit Lions' evolving roster strategy, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss our in-depth NFL analysis. This channel is built for football fans who want more than headlines. We break down the strategy, the decisions, and the ripple effects shaping every franchise in the league. Back on the field, one of the most interesting aspects of Detroit's offseason is what hasn't happened yet. The Lions still have significant flexibility to add players in the second and third waves of free agency. Historically, Brad Holmes has found tremendous value during this phase of the market, signing overlooked veterans who eventually become key contributors. That patience could prove critical again this year. The edge rusher market still contains several intriguing names, and Detroit's defensive front clearly needs reinforcements. Meanwhile, the linebacker depth chart is far from complete, and special teams suffered a major loss when energetic linebacker Grant Stewart signed with the Los Angeles Rams after leading Detroit in special teams snaps. The reality is that the Lions are walking a tightrope. They're trying to preserve a winning culture while navigating the financial consequences of success. They're trying to replace veterans with younger, cheaper players while still competing in a brutal NFC landscape. And they're trying to prove that their rise over the past few seasons was not a fluke, but the beginning of something sustainable. In many ways, this is the ultimate test for Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell. Building a contender is impressive. Keeping one together while the roster evolves is even harder. But if the Lions' plan works, Detroit could emerge from this transitional moment with something incredibly valuable: a younger, faster, and more financially sustainable roster that still has its core stars entering their prime. And if that happens, the rest of the NFL may realize that the Detroit Lions are not just a feel-good story anymore. They're a long-term power. If you made it this far in the breakdown, drop a comment below and tell us what you think about the Lions youth movement. Do you trust Brad Holmes' strategy, or do you think Detroit should be spending more aggressively in free agency? And if you want more deep NFL analysis like this every week, make sure you subscribe to the channel because the next big Lions storyline is already developing, and we'll be here to break it down the moment it happens.